The medulla oblongata connects the pons superiorly with the spinal cord inferiorly. It is conical in shape, its broad extremity being directed superiorly. The central canal of the spinal cord continues into the lower half of the medulla. This is called the closed medulla. In the upper half of the medulla, it expands as the cavity of the fourth ventricle. It forms the lower part of the floor of the fourth ventricle. On the anterior surface of the medulla is the anterior median fissure, which is continuous inferiorly with the anterior median fissure of the spinal cord. On each side of the median fissure, there is a swelling called the pyramid. The pyramids are composed of bundles of nerve fibers called corticospinal fibers because they originate in the large nerve cells in the precentral gyrus of the cerebral cortex, so they are cortico, and spinal because they continue into the spinal cord and form the anterior and lateral corticospinal tracts. This is the gray matter of the spinal cord here, H-shaped or butterfly profile with posterior horn cells, anterior horn cells, a central gray commissure around the central canal, and this is the location of the lateral corticospinal fibers and anterior corticospinal fibers. This is another section of the medulla oblongata showing the pyramids. The majority of these descending fibers, they cross over to the opposite side and they form the decussation of the pyramids. This is the level of the decussation of the pyramids, and we can see the fibers, they cross to the opposite side. About 3/4 of these fibers, they cross and form the lateral corticospinal tract. This is also called the great motor decussation or the decussation of the pyramids. The fibers that do not cross, they form the anterior corticospinal tract, and these fibers eventually will cross to the other side at segmental levels and terminate on anterior horn cells of the spinal cord. This pyramidal tract is concerned with performing rapid, skilled movements. Most of the fibers, they arise from the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. They pass through the corona radiata, internal capsule, and they traverse the cerebral peduncle, the ventral part of the pons, until they reach the medulla oblongata, where they form the pyramids. And then most of the fibers, as I said, they decussate at the level of the decussation of the pyramid in the closed part of the medulla and form the lateral corticospinal fibers. Those that do not decussate, they form the anterior corticospinal fibers in the anterior white column of the spinal cord, and then all these fibers, they terminate into anterior horn cells of the spinal cord. It's a crossed tract. The arcuate nucleus is a group of neurons located on the anterior surface of the medullary pyramids. They receive fibers from corticospinal tract and send their axons through the anterior external arcuate fibers and the stria medullaris, which is located in the floor of the fourth ventricle. These fibers reach the cerebellum via the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Posterolateral to the pyramids are the olives, and these are oval elevations. They are produced by the underlying inferior olivary nuclei. The inferior olivary nucleus is the largest nucleus of what we call an olivary nuclear complex. The gray matter of this nucleus looks like a crumpled bag with its mouth directed medially. There are smaller dorsal and medial olivary nuclei to form the complex. The cells of the inferior olivary nucleus send fibers medially across the midline to enter the cerebellum through the inferior cerebellar peduncle. This is the site of the inferior cerebellar peduncle. There are 3 cerebellar peduncles, inferior, middle, and superior cerebellar peduncles, and these they connect the brainstem parts with the cerebellum. So the inferior connects the medulla oblongata with the cerebellum, the middle connects the pons with the cerebellum, and the superior cerebellar peduncle connects the midbrain with the cerebellum. The function of this olivary nuclear complex, which is formed by the inferior olivary nucleus, the smaller dorsal and medial accessory olivary nuclei, is associated with voluntary muscle movement, control of voluntary muscle movement through its connections with the cerebellum, cerebral cortex, and spinal cord. Here in the closed part of the medulla, the upper part of the closed part, we can see some of the remains of the inferior olivary nucleus. But the main part of this nucleus is located in the open part of the medulla. In the groove between the pyramid and olive emerge the rootlets of the hypoglossal nerve. Posterior to the olives are the inferior cerebellar peduncles, and in the groove between the olive and the inferior cerebellar peduncle emerge the roots of the glossopharyngeal, vagus, and the cranial roots of the accessory nerves. So here we can see the vagus nerve. The posterior surface of the superior half of the medulla, open part of the medulla oblongata, it forms, as I said, part of the floor or the lower part of the floor of the fourth ventricle. However, the posterior surface of the inferior half of the medulla is continuous with the posterior aspect of the spinal cord, and so it has a posterior median sulcus. On each side of the median sulcus there is an elongated swelling. This is the gracile tubercle produced by the underlying nucleus gracilis. Lateral to the gracile tubercle is a similar swelling, the cuneate tubercle, which is produced by the underlying cuneate nucleus. The Fasiculus gracilis and Fasiculus cuneatus ascend superiorly, posterior to the central gray matter in the spinal cord. These are the central fibers of first order neurons whose cell bodies are located in the dorsal root ganglion, and these fibers that are carried in the Fasiculus gracilis and the Fasiculus cuneatus, they are sensory fibers that carry discriminative touch, vibration, and conscious proprioception. They are uncrossed fibers. Here is the location of these fibers in the lower part of the medulla oblongata at the level of the decussation of the pyramids. The second order neurons in this pathway are located in the nucleus gracilis and the nucleus cuneatus, which are located in the upper part of the closed medulla at the level of the decussation of the medial lemniscus. Both Fasiculus gracilis and Fasiculus cuneatus, they carry fibers that are responsible for discriminative touch, vibration, and conscious proprioception. The difference is that fibers entering below mid-thoracic level accumulate medially in the Fasiculus gracilis, while those above the mid-thoracic level are located laterally in the Fasiculus cuneatus. Again, these fibers are first-order neurons whose cell bodies are located in the dorsal root ganglion of the spinal nerve, and they terminate on the cells or neurons which are second-order neurons of the nucleus gracilis and the nucleus cuneatus. A transverse section through the inferior half of the medulla oblongata, which is located a short distance above the level of the decussation of the pyramid, passes through the decussation of the lemnisci, or what we call the great sensory decussation. Here, the fibers of second-order neurons, which are located in the nucleus gracilis and the nucleus cuneatus, these fibers, they form the internal arcuate fibers, and they cross the midline. The medial lemniscus is formed by the ascending fibers from the internal arcuate fibers. So at this level we can see the internal arcuate fibers, but at a higher level we can see the medial lemniscus, which is the continuation upward of the internal arcuate fibers. This is at a higher level where we can see the fibers of the medial lemniscus. the substantia gelatinosa in the posterior gray column of the spinal cord, it becomes continuous with the inferior end of the nucleus of the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve. This is the nucleus of the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve. Here again, there's the nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve. This nucleus is one of the three sensory nuclei of the trigeminal nerve. The first one is the mesencephalic nucleus, which is located in the midbrain. The second one is the main sensory nucleus, which is located in the pons, and the other one is the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, which is responsible for nasty sensations, including pain and temperature sensations, and it is located in the medulla oblongata and the upper two segments of the spinal cord. This nucleus gives rise to the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve. The fibers of the tract of the nucleus are situated between the nucleus and the surface of the medulla oblongata. We can also identify some other white matter tracts, including the anterior spinocerebellar and posterior spinocerebellar tract. This is the anterior spinocerebellar tract and the posterior spinocerebellar tract. They are located at the periphery of the lateral column of white matter, and here they can also be identified at the level of the decussation of the pyramids in the lower part of the medulla, and also they can be identified at the level of the decussation of the medial lemniscus, which is located a little bit higher but in the lower part, closed part of the medulla. In the open part of the medulla, we can see the anterior spinocerebellar tract only, because the posterior spinocerebellar tract passes through the inferior cerebellar peduncle heading to the cerebellum. These fibers are responsible for unconscious proprioception. Unconscious proprioception from the trunk and lower limbs. The fibers are fibers of second-order neurons, which are located in the nucleus dorsalis or Clark's column, which is located at the base of the posterior horn of the spinal cord. It receives fibers from muscles and tendons carrying unconscious proprioceptive sensations. The cell bodies of first-order neurons are located in the dorsal root ganglion, and they relay in the nucleus dorsalis or Clark's column. Fibers from nucleus dorsalis that are going to form the posterior spinocerebellar tract are uncrossed fibers. They ascend in the posterior spinocerebellar tract of the ipsilateral side, and they terminate in the cerebellar cortex via the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Fibers of the anterior spinocerebellar tract, they have crossed from the other side. They cross in the anterior white commissure, and they ascend up in the anterior spinocerebellar tract. Then they terminate in the cerebellar cortex after crossing via the superior cerebellar peduncle. So these fibers of the anterior spinocerebellar tract, they cross twice. Other fibers that can be seen in the medullary sections are the fibers of the spinothalamic tracts. We have lateral and anterior spinothalamic tracts. This is the location of the lateral spinothalamic tract and the anterior spinothalamic tracts. The lateral spinothalamic tract carries pain and temperature sensation fibers. These are crossed fibers of neurons in the posterior gray column, including the substantia gelatinosa. They originate from substantia gelatinosa and the nucleus proprius, and they cross in the anterior white commissure to ascend up. Fibers of the lateral spinothalamic tract are therefore second-order neurons. The first-order neurons are located in the dorsal root ganglion of a spinal nerve. The anterior spinothalamic tract carries fibers related to light touch and pressure, and again these fibers are crossed fibers of neurons in the posterior gray column, including the substantia gelatinosa and the nucleus proprius. Sometimes the fibers of the anterior and lateral spinothalamic tract together are called the spinal lemniscus, together with fibers of the spinotectal tract. So here we have the spinal lemniscus again at the level of the decussation of the medial lemniscus, and in the closed part of the medulla, this is again the site of the spinal lemniscus located laterally. The spinotectal tract, which is included in the spinal lemniscus, is related to spino-visual reflexes, movements of the eyes and head toward the source of stimulation. Fibers terminate in the superior colliculus of the midbrain. The superior colliculus, which is responsible for visual reflexes. At the level of the open part of the medulla, the upper part of the medulla, we can see the vestibulocochlear nuclei. Here we have two groups of nuclei, a vestibular nuclear complex and the cochlear nuclei. This nuclear complex extends from the medulla to the pons. Here we have in the medulla, we have the inferior vestibular nucleus and the medial vestibular nucleus. They cause an elevation in the floor of the fourth ventricle located laterally, which is called the vestibular trigone. The other nuclei, the lateral and superior vestibular nuclei, are located in the pons. The cochlear nuclei, we have the posterior cochlear nucleus and anterior cochlear nucleus. The anterior is so closely situated anterolateral to the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and the posterior is located posterior to the peduncle, inferior cerebellar peduncle. The cochlear nuclei, they receive impulses concerned with sound via the cochlear nerve from the spiral ganglion of the cochlea via the cochlear nerve, and the vestibular nuclei, they receive impulses concerned with position and movement of the head from the utricle, saccule, and the semicircular canals via the vestibular nerve. At the upper part of the medulla oblongata, level of the inferior olivary complex, inferior olivary nucleus, there is another nucleus which is called the nucleus ambiguus. Here is the site of the nucleus ambiguus. This nucleus is the motor nucleus for the muscles of the palate, pharynx, and larynx. Therefore, efferent fibers from this nucleus join the glossopharyngeal vagus and the accessory nerve, the cranial root of the accessory nerve. Here we can see the fibers joining the vagus nerve. This is also the site of the reticular formation, which is a diffuse mixture of nerve fibers and groups of nerve cells. Represent a small part of the system, of the reticular system, which is also present in the pons and the midbrain. Another nucleus is the hypoglossal nucleus, which is responsible for an elevation here in the medial part of the floor of the lower part of the fourth ventricle, hypoglossal trigone. Fibers from this nucleus, they provide the motor supply for the muscles of the tongue through the hypoglossal nerve. Lateral to this nucleus, lateral to the hypoglossal nucleus, is the dorsal nucleus of the vagus, which is responsible for another elevation, the vagal trigone, in the floor of the fourth ventricle. This dorsal nucleus of the vagus is the source of the preganglionic parasympathetic motor fibers for the involuntary muscles that are supplied by the vagus nerve, like the cardiac muscles, the smooth muscles of the tracheobronchial tree, and the smooth muscles of the GI tract. Another nucleus is the nucleus of the tractus solitarius, and this is located in the medulla, extends up also in the pons. This is the nucleus that receives taste fibers, so it receives from the vagus, glossopharyngeal, and from the facial nerve in the pons. Here it is shown to receive fibers from the vagus nerve. Here these fibers have originated from the posterior third of the tongue. Again, at the level of the olive, we can see the medial lemniscus fibers conveying sensory information, which are now crossed fibers from the nucleus, gracilis, and cuneatus. These fibers are heading to the thalamus. They pass through the pons, midbrain, and go into the thalamus, where third order neurons will carry these sensations to the postcentral gyrus. Dorsal to the medial lemniscus, there is another fasciculus, which is called the medial longitudinal fasciculus. This fasciculus contains ascending and descending fibers that connect the vestibular and cochlear nuclei with the nuclei controlling extraocular muscles, like the oculomotor nucleus, trochlear nucleus, which are located in the midbrain, and the abducent nucleus, which is located in the pons. The tectospinal tract arises from nerve cells in the superior colliculus of the midbrain. Most of the fibers, they cross the midline. They pass through the brainstem close to the medial longitudinal fasciculus. And we can see them here. And in the lower part of the medulla, they are very close to the midline. Then they descend through the anterior white column of the spinal cord in the upper cervical segments of the spinal cord and terminate by synapsing with interneurons. They control body reflexes in response to visual stimuli. To complete the picture, here are some descending tracts of the spinal cord, which constitute the extrapyramidal fibers, including the vestibulospinal tract, rubrospinal, olivospinal, in addition to the tectospinal and reticulospinal tracts. It should be expected that all these tracts travel through the medulla. In lateral medullary syndrome, or Wallenberg syndrome, which is a vascular disorder affecting the medulla oblongata, resulting from thrombosis of the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, or thrombosis of the vertebral artery, this will affect the lateral part of the medulla. Thus, if the spinothalamic tract is affected, then there will be analgesia and thermoanesthesia in the trunks and limbs on the contralateral side of the body. Involvement of the vestibular nuclei will result in vertigo, nausea, vomiting, and nystagmus. Involvement of the nucleus and spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve result in analgesia and thermoanesthesia in the head, ipsilateral to the lesion. Involvement of the nucleus ambiguous results in dysphagia and dysphonia because this nucleus is the motor nucleus of the muscles of the pharynx, larynx, and palate. And involvement of the inferior cerebellar peduncle will result in ataxia. So all these structures will be affected because they are located in the lateral part of the medulla. In another vascular disorder, which is called the medial medullary syndrome, the medial medullary syndrome results from thrombosis of the medullary branch of the vertebral artery, and this will affect the pyramidal tract, therefore, and result in hemiparesis contralateral to the lesion because these pyramidal fibers, corticospinal fibers, are going to decussate later on either at the medullary decussation, which is located lower down, or the fibers that are going to form the anterior corticospinal tract are going to decussate at segmental levels. So involvement of the pyramid will result in contralateral hemiparesis. Involvement of the medial lemniscus, which is also located medially, results in impaired sensation of position, movement, and tactile discrimination, because this is the modality of sensation that is carried by the medial lemniscus. It will also affect the contralateral side of the body because these fibers have already decussated in the lower part of the medulla at the level of the medial lemniscal decussation. Involvement of the hypoglossal nerve will result in ipsilateral paralysis of the muscles of the tongue, lower motor neuron lesion on the same side of the body, and when the tongue is protruded, it will deviate to the same side of the lesion.